400 people watched her walk in, and not one of them asked if she was hurt. Adeline Thornquist was 27, a trauma nurse, and she arrived at her own engagement party in a blood-stained ivory gown with one shoe missing. She'd left the other one on the shoulder of Interstate 93, tucked under the head of a dying man. The string quartet stopped mid-measure. Weston Ashgrove IV, 33, a senator's son, the man she was supposed to marry, didn't ask what happened. He took the ring out of his jacket, set it down on a passing waiter's tray the way a person sets down a dirty glass, and said, "Are you finished humiliating me?" She told them the truth. A man had been bleeding out on the highway shoulder. 3 cars slowed, looked, and drove on. She'd knelt in the wet grass and held pressure for 40 minutes with the hem of her own dress. Her father came down from the head table and didn't raise his voice. Not once. He simply unclasped the pearl necklace from her throat, the only thing she had left of her mother, and closed his fist around it. "You're not a Thornquist tonight." Adeline didn't argue. She only said, quietly, "I kept him breathing for 40 minutes. I think she would have been proud of that." Then she walked out barefoot on one side, past 400 people who saw the blood on her dress and never once asked whose it was. Here's what none of them knew. The man on that highway shoulder was Silvio Braganza, 34, and every dock worker and every police captain in Boston knew his name well enough not to say it out loud. And when he opened his eyes, bleeding through her hands, he looked up at a stranger in a wedding dress and said something she assumed was the blood loss talking. He said her name. If stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things mean something to you, take a second to hit like, share this with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. It helps more than you know. Now let's go back to that morning, 14 hours earlier, when Adeline Thornquist still had a family, a job she loved, and no idea what was waiting for her on that road. 4 o'clock in the morning on the 4th floor of St. Bernadette Hospital was the quietest time of the day, when the only sound in the corridor was the water heater gurgling inside the walls and the yellow lights casting small pools across the floor. Adeline Thornquist had just signed the final handover sheet of her final night shift before her engagement day. She removed her gloves, washed her hands beneath the cold running water, and instead of heading straight toward the elevator like the other nurses, she turned left and walked to the end of the corridor, where a door was always left slightly ajar because the boy inside didn't like complete darkness. Toby was still awake. The 7-year-old boy sat propped against his pillows, his sketchbook open on his lap, while the glow from the nightlight spread a warm orange hue across the page. When he heard the door, he looked up and smiled at once. The kind of smile worn by someone who had been waiting a very long time for another person, but had no intention of admitting it. "You're late," he said. "I had to finish all my work before I could come," Adeline replied, pulling the plastic chair closer to the bed. "You should have been asleep ages ago." "I was asleep. Then I woke up again." "That doesn't count as sleeping." "Yes, it does. It was just short." She laughed softly, then reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a box of colored pencils, still sealed beneath its clear plastic cover. She had bought it with her own money at the convenience store near the streetcar stop and hidden it in her locker for 2 days, waiting for this particular shift. Toby accepted the box with both hands and turned it beneath the light as though it were something far more precious than its price suggested. "There's a gray one," he whispered. "It took me forever to find one with gray. This is exactly the gray I need." He opened his sketchbook, flipped past several pages filled with clumsy drawings, then stopped at one and turned the book around to face her. There was a cat on the page, a cat covered in 3 smudged colors layered over one another, and behind it was an unmistakable empty space where its tail should have been. "It doesn't have a tail," Adeline said, "because it lost it." "You think so?" "I know. I saw it for real." He pointed toward the window, beyond which there was nothing but darkness and a few dim streetlights. "It walks on that rooftop over there. It walks there every night. It isn't afraid of anything." Adeline looked out the window, then back at the drawing, and finally at the boy. "Then you should give it a name." "I haven't thought of one yet. It has to be a very impressive name." "Yes, a cat that walks alone across rooftops ought to have an impressive name." She sat with him a little longer, long enough for him to finish shading the cat with his new gray pencil, then pulled the blanket up around him and turned off one of the lights. By the time she stepped into the corridor, the sound of wheels rolling across the floor echoed from the direction of the stairwell. Consuelo Reyes was pushing the floor cleaning cart toward the end of the hall, her janitorial uniform hanging loosely from her shoulders. She hadn't taken the night shift at the hospital because it paid more. She had taken it because it was the only shift that allowed her to remain beneath the same roof as her grandson, even though her shift began just as he fell asleep and ended before he woke. "Is he awake?" she asked. "He said he was asleep, just briefly." Consuelo laughed, the laugh of someone long accustomed to answers like that. The two women sat down on the plastic chairs beside the vending machine and shared a cup of coffee from the machine. Coffee they both knew was terrible, though neither of them had ever complained. "My girl used to draw too," Consuelo said after a while. "His mother, I mean. She drew all the time when she was little." "You've never told me about his mother." "Because if I talk about her, I have to remember." She slowly turned the coffee cup between her hands. "My girl was gone before Toby could even say mama clearly. He never had the chance to know his mother's face." Adeline didn't ask anything more. She had learned long ago that there were some questions for which silence was the kindest answer. The two women remained there for a little while longer in the cold corridor, until the sound of firm footsteps came from the nurse's station. Rosalind Pike, the head nurse, stopped in front of them with her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose and a clipboard in her hand. "Your shift ended half an hour ago, Thornquist. I know. You truly are the only person on this floor who remembers every patient's name." Adeline stood, slipped her coat back on, and answered in a voice so gentle that she might have been stating the most obvious truth in the world. "Because in here, a person has nothing left but their name." Rosalind studied her for a long moment, then merely nodded and walked away. The house on Beacon Hill welcomed her with its customary silence, the silence of a dentist's waiting room, where everyone was waiting for something unpleasant to happen, and no one wanted to be the first to speak. Adeline entered through the side door, the scent of the hospital still clinging to her hair, and the first person she encountered was the housekeeper, who merely gave her a slight nod before continuing on her way. On the second floor, the dressing room door stood wide open. Margot Thornquist was standing in the middle of the room, with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes traveling over her husband's daughter from head to toe in the way someone might inspect a piece of furniture that had been delivered in the wrong color. "You've just come back from the hospital," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. People will start arriving this afternoon." She stepped closer and reached out to adjust Adeline's collar, then paused at the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. The pearls had faded with age. They were no longer white, but had turned an old shade of cream, the kind of color found only in objects that had passed through many hands. "You're planning to wear this tonight?" "Yes. It's outdated, darling. People will think our family can't afford to buy you anything new." "It belonged to my mother." "Your mother has been dead for a very long time." Margot withdrew her hand and smiled, a smile measured to the precise degree, the same one Adeline had seen throughout all the years she had lived beneath this roof. "She isn't the one who has to stand in front of 400 people tonight." Adeline didn't remove the necklace. She merely lifted a hand and touched it once, very gently, before lowering her hand again. In the corner of the room, Priscilla was turning before the mirror in her pale blue bridesmaid dress, tilting her head as she examined the curve of the waistline. Adeline's half-sister was a few years younger, with the same bright blonde hair as her mother, and a way of speaking that always sounded like a joke, until people realized it wasn't. "Do you know what everyone's saying?" Priscilla asked the mirror rather than her sister. "They say father must have paid a fortune to find someone willing to marry you." The words fell onto the floor like a glass slipping from someone's hand. Priscilla fell silent at once. She looked into the mirror and caught Adeline's gaze reflected there, then quickly bent down to adjust the hem of her dress, her face turning red all the way to her ears. She didn't apologize. She didn't say anything else. Adeline only said softly, "The dress is beautiful," and walked out. Downstairs, Weston Ashgrove IV had arrived ahead of the appointed time, as he always did, because arriving early was a way to make others see him as considerate, without costing him anything. He stood in the center of the foyer with a glass of water in his hand, telling some story that made the three people around him laugh at once. A young server carrying a tray walked past, caught his foot on the edge of the rug, and spilled a glass of water from the tray, soaking one side of Weston's leather shoe. The entire foyer went silent for half a second. The server turned pale and stammered an apology, while Weston merely smiled, a broad and generous smile, the kind that made everyone who saw it think he was a remarkably pleasant man. "It's all right," he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Shoes can dry. Just stay calm." Someone praised him for his kindness. Adeline smiled, and for that brief moment, her smile was sincere. A few minutes later, she went to retrieve the shawl she had left in the study, and just as her hand settled on the doorknob, she heard his voice on the other side. It had grown quieter, and its tone had changed completely. "No, I don't care if you're short-staffed tonight. Dismiss him. Today. I don't want to see his face in this house again." A silence followed, because that was his job, and he failed to do it. Adeline remained motionless behind the door, her hand still resting on the knob, but she didn't push it open. She stood there until she heard him put down the telephone, then quietly stepped backward and took another route. By that afternoon, when the car carrying them left Beacon Hill, Weston leaned back against the leather seat, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "After the wedding, I want you to quit your job." She turned to look at him. "What did you say?" "The hospital. I want you to leave," he continued, staring straight ahead. "I can't have my wife walking around with the smell of disinfectant on her hands all the time. People will shake your hand, they'll smell it, and they'll start thinking all sorts of things." Adeline looked down at her hands, at the skin across their backs, dry and cracked from being washed too many times in a single night. "It's the scent of people who are still alive," she said. Weston didn't answer. He simply reached over and turned on the music, and the car continued toward the heart of the city. The car came to a stop for the third time in less than 10 minutes, and this time, it didn't move another inch. Ahead of them, a line of red taillights stretched all the way to the curve where the road disappeared from view, motionless, like a cord someone had pulled tight and tied at both ends. The driver tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, glanced at the clock on the dashboard, then looked into the rearview mirror. "Miss Thornquist, traffic has been backed up here for a long time. Something happened on the overpass. With your permission, I'll take the old route. The road is narrower, but I'm certain it'll be clear. Do whatever you think is best." The car turned onto the exit and followed the service road running parallel to Interstate 93, where knee-high weeds grew along both sides, and old streetlights stood too far apart to illuminate anything. It wasn't completely dark yet. The last light of day spread a muted yellow glow across the road, the kind of light that made everything appear farther away than it truly was. Then Adeline saw it. A black sedan sat at an angle beside the road, its left side crushed inward like a crumpled can, the front door hanging wide open and swaying gently in the wind created by passing cars. There was no one inside. On the grass a few steps away, a man lay on his side with one arm wrapped around his stomach, his white shirt covered in dirt and scraps of grass. He wasn't moving. "Stop," she said. The driver had seen him. He didn't stop. He slowed down, but only slightly, his eyes darting toward the damaged car before immediately returning to the road ahead. "Someone else has already called for help. I'm sure someone has called." At that moment, a silver sports car came up from behind and passed them. It slowed when it drew level with the man on the ground, slowly enough for the two people inside to turn their heads and look at him, then accelerated and vanished around the curve. The second car did exactly the same thing. The third was a white family car, and it came to a complete stop a short distance from theirs. The passenger window rolled down. A woman around Margot's age, her hair arranged in a neat bun and sunglasses covering her eyes even though dusk had already begun to settle, leaned outside and spoke to the driver in the tone of someone offering helpful advice. "Don't be foolish. That car belongs to organized crime. You can tell just by looking at it. Get involved, and you'll have trouble for the rest of your life." "Yes, I know," the driver replied. "Go. Don't stay here." The window rose again. The white car pulled away, and during the few seconds it remained in sight, Adeline saw the woman turn to speak to her husband. They both shook their heads as though they had narrowly avoided coming into contact with something filthy. Then they were gone. Adeline opened the car door. "Miss Thornquist." She was already outside. The grass was wet. The earth felt soft beneath the soles of her shoes, and the faint smell of gasoline mingled in the air with the scent of crushed grass. She walked toward the man and stopped about 3 steps away, not because she was afraid, but because she had already seen it. She had worked in the emergency room long enough that no one needed to explain it to her. The wound in his abdomen hadn't been caused by the collision. There were no shards of glass, no cuts, none of the jagged tearing that metal and speed left upon human skin. It was round, clean, and in the wrong place. It was a gunshot wound. Adeline remained still for the length of a single breath. She understood perfectly well what she was looking at. She understood that the man lying on the ground had been shot by someone, that whoever had shot him might still be somewhere nearby, that this incident would have a name in a police report, and her name would appear beside it, and that 400 people were sitting in a grand hall less than half an hour's drive away, all of them waiting for her. She thought of her father's face. She thought of what Margot had said that afternoon. She thought of Weston's hands resting on the steering wheel, and the sound of his voice behind the study door. She thought of all those things in less time than it took to blink. Then the man on the ground drew a breath, and that breath made a sound, the dry, shallow sound she had heard hundreds of times, but had never grown accustomed to, the sound of a body counting down its final moments. His skin had turned the gray color of cold ashes. Adeline knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" She placed both hands over his abdomen and pressed down. "Don't go to sleep. Can you hear me? Don't go to sleep." 2 hands weren't enough. She knew it from the very first second, when she felt the warmth seeping between her fingers faster than she could stop it. Adeline sat upright, grabbed the right side of her skirt, found the seam where the fabric had been stitched together, and pulled hard. The silk didn't tear at once. It was stronger than she had expected, and she had to use her teeth to open a split along the edge before she could rip a long strip from the hem all the way to her knee. She folded it into several layers, placed it over the wound, and pressed down with the full weight of her upper body. "Have you called emergency services?" The driver stood a few steps away with the telephone pressed to his ear, his face deathly pale. "Yes, they said they're on their way." "Did you tell them clearly that a gun was involved?" "Tell them. They need to know so they can send the right team." He repeated the information into the telephone, stumbling over his words, then lowered it and stepped closer, though he didn't dare come all the way over. "Miss Thornquist, I'm begging you, please get back into the car. I'll take you to the hotel, then I'll come straight back here. I'll stay with him until the ambulance arrives. I swear. Do you know where to apply pressure?" "No. Then you can't stay with him." The asphalt was only a hand's breadth from the man's head, and it still held the heat of an entire day beneath the sun, releasing it in faint, shimmering waves. Adeline looked down, kept her left hand pressed firmly against the wound, then reached toward her foot with her right hand and removed her left shoe. She slipped it beneath the back of his neck, adjusted it until the softest part of the lining rested beneath the point of contact, then gently turned his head to one side so his airway wouldn't become obstructed. "Miss, that dress is terribly expensive. Then let it do something worthwhile today." She lowered herself close to the man's face. "Listen to me. Can you hear me? Stay here with me. Breathe slowly. Don't strain yourself. Slowly." There was no response for a very long time, so long that she began counting the rhythm in her mind merely to keep herself from thinking about anything else. Then his eyelids moved. They opened with great difficulty, only halfway. His eyes were pale amber, a color she had never seen in anyone else, so light that in the last glow of the day, they appeared almost transparent. He looked at her. It wasn't the vacant gaze of someone drifting away. He looked at her like a man who had just recognized someone in the middle of a crowd. His lips moved. No sound emerged. She leaned closer, bringing her ear near his mouth. "Say it again. I can't hear you." This time, she heard him clearly. "Adeline." She froze. Her hands remained pressed in the same place. But for half a second, exactly half a second, her entire body became as still as a clock whose hands had suddenly been stopped. She lifted her head and studied his face. She had never met this man. She was certain of it in the same way a person was certain of their own face in the mirror. He wasn't a former patient. He wasn't an acquaintance of her father. And he wasn't a name connected to any room she had ever entered. "What did you say?" But his eyes had already closed. His head slipped slightly to one side upon her shoe. "No, no, you can't. Open your eyes." She shook his shoulder with her free hand. "You just said my name. Open your eyes and say it again." He didn't open his eyes again. Adeline drew a deep breath and allowed the thought to pass through her mind and fall away. The thought that a man who had lost this much blood might say anything, might call out any name, and perhaps he had been calling for someone else who happened to share her name, someone in another place, on another day that had passed long ago. She pressed down harder. The ambulance arrived much later than she had expected. By the time the siren finally sounded from beyond the curve, darkness had completely fallen, and both her arms were numb all the way to her shoulders. People came running. They fired questions at her one after another, and she answered each of them in the language only those wearing reflective uniforms understood. Pulse, estimated blood pressure, duration of compression, location of the wound. One of the paramedics looked her over from head to toe, taking in the white dress that was no longer white and her bare foot resting on the earth. "Are you a doctor?" "A nurse." "Are you coming with us?" She climbed into the ambulance. Later, when people recounted what had happened that evening, each person remembered a different detail, but everyone remembered the sound. It wasn't the sound of the music stopping. It was the sound that came immediately afterward, the whispering that rose from the table nearest the door and spread throughout the grand hall in precisely the way water spilled over the edge of a table, slowly during the first few seconds, then becoming impossible to contain. People leaned their heads toward one another. They raised their hands to their mouths without truly concealing anything. Someone at a table in the middle of the room murmured that this would end up in the newspapers, and the person beside him nodded as though that were the most regrettable thing among all the regrettable things unfolding around them. Not one person stood up. That was the detail a young server standing in the corner of the room would remember for the rest of his life. That in an entire grand hall crowded with people, no one stood up. Margot Thornquist sat at the head table with her back as straight as a ruler. She didn't look toward the door. She looked down at the napkin in her lap, smoothed it once, then smoothed it a second time even though it was already perfectly flat, and kept her eyes fixed there from beginning to end. When the moment required a reaction, she smiled at the woman seated to her right and said something that made the woman nod sympathetically. That was all she did. Priscilla was standing, not sitting. She stood about 2 steps from her father, still holding a glass of lemonade, and she was the only person in that grand hall who saw everything clearly from such a close distance. She saw her father's hand rise. She saw his fingers close. And in that moment, something sprang to life inside her chest. A sound that had already traveled halfway to her throat. A word. Just one word. The word she had used to address him ever since she had learned to speak. Her lips had already parted. Then she looked around and saw 400 faces turned in that direction, and she swallowed the word back down. She took a sip of lemonade. Many years later, when everything had passed and had finally been given a name, Priscilla still couldn't remember what song the band had played that evening, or which shoes she had worn, but she remembered the exact taste of that sip of lemonade, and she would never drink it again. Gerald Thornquist didn't shout. That was what made the people present more uncomfortable than anything else. And it was also what they repeated most often afterward. People could forgive an angry father. They understood anger. But he didn't raise his voice, didn't strike the table, and not a single vein appeared at his temple. He spoke in the same voice he used in the boardroom on the highest floor of the building that bore his name, the voice of a man reading the final clause before signing. Clear, just loud enough to be heard, without a single unnecessary word. A man seated at the third table, who had done business with the Thornquist Corporation for many years, later told his wife that he had heard that voice many times in his life, but that was the first time it had ever frightened him. Then it was over, and the grand hall took a very long time to remember what it was supposed to do next. People lifted their glasses. The band began another song from the beginning. At the far end of the room, the service door closed very softly. The corridor beyond it was narrow, paved with gray tiles, illuminated by harsh white lights, and filled with the mingled odors of dishwashing liquid and cold food. An older waiter stacking trays on top of one another heard approaching footsteps and looked up. He didn't ask any questions. He merely took one look at her, then removed his uniform jacket, a gray wool garment worn thin at the elbows, and held it out to her. "It's very windy outside, miss." She was about to tell him she didn't need it. "I once had a daughter who was a nurse," he said. "She used to come home in cold weather without wearing anything suitable, too." He placed the jacket in her hands, then returned to his stack of trays as though he had merely completed an ordinary task during his shift. Adeline draped the jacket over her shoulders and left through the back door. The rented room was on the 3rd floor of an old building in East Boston, and the only thing it offered that other places in the same price range didn't was a window overlooking the harbor. During the day, that window showed her nothing but stacked shipping containers and a row of motionless cranes. But at night, when the lights along the docks came on and stretched across the water in trembling ribbons of gold, the view was almost beautiful. Adeline moved in with one suitcase and a cloth bag, nothing more. The landlord was a middle-aged man who spoke English with an Italian accent. He asked what she did for a living, and when she told him she was a nurse, he nodded and said that was good because people in that profession usually paid their rent on time. She found work at a laundromat 4 blocks away, on a shift that ran from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Her duties included making change, mopping the floor, clearing lint from the dryers, and making sure no one stayed behind the glass doors to sleep there overnight. She worked nights because the night shift paid a little more, and because after staying awake through the night for so many years, her body no longer knew how to sleep when darkness fell. She believed this would only be temporary. She had calculated everything carefully in her mind. She still had her profession, and as long as she had that, she still had a road back. St. Bernadette Hospital might find the situation awkward for a while, but the city had many hospitals, and surely none of them would turn away an emergency room nurse with so many years of experience. She had already prepared an answer for the question of why she had left her former position. She had even folded a clean uniform and placed it in the drawer. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, wedged between several advertisements in the shared mailbox downstairs. The envelope was ivory white and bore the logo of the State Medical Board, and she opened it at the foot of the stairs because she didn't have enough patience to climb 3 flights first. She read it once from beginning to end without understanding any of it. She read it a second time, more slowly. Her nursing license had been suspended, effective immediately, pending a hearing. The accusation concerned her removal of a controlled pain medication from the medicine cabinet without completing the required paperwork, an incident that had occurred 2 years earlier. Adeline stood at the bottom of the stairs for a very long time, still holding the letter in her hand. And the first thing she felt wasn't fear but an almost absurd sense of confusion, because the matter had ended long ago. She remembered it clearly. There had been a homeless man with no insurance who was in so much pain that he couldn't lie down, and the hospital had no procedure for dispensing medication to someone without a medical record. She had taken the medicine. The following week, she had paid out of her own pocket to replace the exact amount. It was only the paperwork that she had delayed, first because she was busy, then because she forgot, and then the man was gone, and she never thought about it again. No one at the hospital knew. No one checked. No one ever asked. Then she straightened, and the chill running down her spine came not from the letter but from something else, something she realized more slowly than she should have. There was only one person in the world who knew about it. She had told him one winter night the year before, when they were sitting in the car outside her house after a long party, and she was tired, and she had confessed that there were times when she did things that could cost her everything if anyone examined them too closely, and he had asked her to give him an example. She had told him everything, including the name of the medication, the fact that she had replaced it, and the fact that she had forgotten to complete the paperwork. She remembered that he had fallen silent for a moment, then taken her hand, and said he was glad she trusted him enough to tell him. She had trusted him. That was what hurt her most. Not losing her license. Not losing the hospital. Not losing the name she had carried since birth. It was remembering that on that night, she had felt safe. Adeline folded the letter in half, then folded it into quarters, and climbed all 3 flights of stairs without touching the handrail once. The 3 cars arrived at dusk, just after Adeline had awakened, and while she was making coffee before her night shift at the laundromat. They were 3 black sport utility vehicles parked one behind another along the curb, and none of them shut off its engine completely. She heard them before she saw them, because the entire street suddenly fell silent. The children playing soccer at the end of the block grabbed their ball and ran inside. The fruit vendor across the street began folding up his awning earlier than usual. Even the dog next door, the one that barked from morning until night, went quiet. Adeline stood at the window and looked down. She wasn't afraid, and that surprised her a little, until she realized the reason was so simple. It was almost laughable. She had nothing left to lose. There was a knock at the door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced and unhurried. The man standing in the hallway was around her father's age, with hair that had turned almost entirely silver, broad shoulders, and a long coat. He held his hat in his hands like someone who had stepped out of another era. He didn't look past her shoulder into the room. He looked directly into her eyes, and his voice was very soft. "My name is Hugo Mancuso. My employer would like to speak with you. We'll take you there and bring you home. And the moment you tell us to stop, we'll stop." "What if I refuse to go? Then I'll leave, and no one will trouble you again." She reached for her coat. The restaurant was in the North End, on a narrow cobblestone street, and its sign had been dark for a long time. Inside, the chairs had been turned upside down on the tables, except for a single table at the far end of the room that had been left untouched, with a small lamp casting its light across the tablecloth. The man sitting there wore a white shirt without a tie, his sleeves neatly rolled up, while his left forearm remained wrapped in bandages. He rose when she entered. He stood slowly, and she immediately realized that he was trying to conceal his pain. "You shouldn't be standing." "I know," he said, "but there are certain things I don't do while sitting down." Silvio Braganza pulled out a chair for her, then sat across from her. On the table were an untouched cup of coffee and a thick brown envelope. He pushed the envelope across the table toward her. "I heard you lost your job. I heard you're washing other people's clothes at night. You hear a great deal. That's my job." Adeline looked at the envelope. She thought about the following month's rent. She thought about the empty refrigerator in her rented room. Then she placed 2 fingers against the edge of the envelope and pushed it back to the center of the table. "I won't take it. You need it." "I need a great many things," she said, "but if you pay me for what happened that day, then what I did beside that road will no longer be what I did. It'll become a transaction. You pay, I accept, the debt between us is settled, and everything becomes neat and tidy." She looked directly at him. "I've already lost almost everything. There's only one good thing left inside me. I won't sell it for rent money." Silvio said nothing for a very long time. He looked at the envelope lying between them as though it had just said something that forced him to reconsider, then picked it up and placed it inside the drawer of the table beside him. "In all these years," he said, "no one has ever pushed it back toward me." Adeline placed both hands on the table. "Then I'm going to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer." "Ask." "That day, you said my name. You were lying there. You were about to stop breathing, and you said my name. How did you know who I was?" Something changed very slightly in his face, so slightly that she would have missed it if she hadn't spent her life studying other people's faces to understand where they were hurting. "Because I had been looking for you," he said, "for many years." "Why were you looking for me?" "Because I owe someone a debt. That person is gone now, and the only way I can repay it is by finding you." "Who was that person?" Silvio lifted the cup of cold coffee, then set it down again without drinking. "It isn't time yet." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means that if I tell you now, you'll stand up and run from this room." Adeline leaned forward. "Do you think I'm frightened that easily?" "No." He looked up, and those pale amber eyes met hers directly. "I think you're brave enough to hear it. I'm simply not brave enough to say it yet." St. Leo Church stood on the corner with the oldest maple tree in the neighborhood, and Father Emmett Sarsfield had been there so long that no one in the community could remember who had served before him. He came to see Adeline one morning, just after her shift at the laundromat had ended, while she was sitting on the steps of her rented building, eating a piece of bread. "You're that nurse, aren't you?" "I used to be." "I have a basement," he said, standing before her with one hand resting on his cane. "It's damp, it's cold, and it hasn't done anything useful since I still had hair. If you want to use it, I'll lend it to you." "Father, my license has been suspended." "I didn't ask about your piece of paper. I asked whether you know how to bandage a wound." She opened the basement the following week. Her first patient was an elderly Portuguese woman named Amalia, who lived alone on the ground floor of a building 2 blocks from the church. She came because her daughter-in-law had told her to, and she sat down with the expression of someone who expected to be scolded. "I have medicine," she said at once. "I have a prescription. I just haven't gone to collect it." "How long has it been since you were supposed to collect it?" The old woman looked down at her hands. "The heating bill went up this month. I thought I'd wait until next month." Adeline didn't say anything about that. She simply checked the woman's blood sugar, wrote the number in a student notebook she had bought at the convenience store, then told her to return the following week and the week after that. On her 3rd visit, the old woman brought a box of homemade cookies. By her 5th, she had begun staying longer than necessary, telling stories about her late husband and the fish shop they had once owned near the docks. After the old woman came a boy named Emiliano, 16 years old, who limped into the basement after a basketball game on a concrete court, his ankle badly swollen. Adeline wrapped it, told him to rest for 2 weeks, and he rested for exactly 2 days before returning to the court. But from that day forward, he appeared in the basement every Saturday afternoon with a broom in his hand, though no one had asked him to come. The cat arrived even before old Amalia did. It was a calico cat, with 3 smudged colors layered over one another, and where its tail should have been, there was only a short stump. No one knew where it had come from. Father Emmett claimed it had been there before he arrived, which was clearly a lie. The neighborhood children called it the Countess, because it had a habit of sitting on the highest step and looking down at everyone else like someone who had just purchased the building. It wouldn't let anyone hold it. It wouldn't let anyone pet it. It had only one concern in life, and that concern was Silvio Braganza. The first time he entered the basement, it lay in wait on top of the filing cabinet until he walked directly beneath it, then dropped onto his shoulder. The second time, it did the same thing. By the fourth time, Hugo Mancuso was already standing at the foot of the stairs, with Silvio's coat draped over his arm, his face entirely expressionless, like someone who had been doing this for years and no longer considered it worthy of comment. Silvio removed the cat from his shoulder and set it on the floor, and it immediately climbed back onto the filing cabinet to prepare for the next time. He never said anything about it. One Thursday afternoon, Adeline called the pharmacy department of a major hospital to ask about obtaining a medication that old Amalia needed, one that was only distributed through official channels and that smaller pharmacies didn't keep in stock. After listening to her explanation, the person on the other end asked for her license number. She said that her license was currently suspended. The call ended politely and decisively. Silvio stood at the far end of the room with his sleeves rolled up, studying the patient list posted on the wall. He didn't ask any questions. He took out his telephone, dialed a number, raised it to his ear, and when someone answered, he said exactly 4 words: "I need a favor." Then he ended the call and returned to reading the list. Before the afternoon was over, an unmarked delivery van stopped outside the church gate. 2 men unloaded a sealed cardboard box with complete paperwork attached to the outside and an intact inspection seal. Everything so thoroughly legal that there was nothing anyone could question. Adeline looked at the box, then at him. "What did you just do?" "Many years ago, I helped a man keep his son. Today," he remembered. He took the coat Hugo was holding and put it on. "Do you know the difference between the wealthy and the powerful?" "What is it?" "The wealthy can buy things. The powerful don't have to buy anything at all." Old Amalia arrived later than usual on Wednesday afternoon, carrying her box of cookies as she always did, but this time the box was lighter, and she set it on the table in the way someone might lay down an apology. "There aren't very many, are there? You don't need to bring anything at all. My grandson's bakery is having a difficult month." She sat down, removed her scarf, and waited a long while before continuing. "Someone came to collect money. He already came once last month, and now he has come again this month. My grandson said it was never like this before. It was always once a month. You paid, and that was the end of it. Now he comes twice. He says the price has gone up." Adeline stopped what she was doing. "Have you told anyone about this?" "Who would I tell? If I said anything, it would only bring more trouble." She didn't say anything further. But the following afternoon, when Silvio stopped by the basement, as he often did without ever giving notice, she told him everything from beginning to end, repeating exactly what the old woman had said, without adding or omitting anything. He listened until she had finished. He didn't ask a single question. He merely stood there for a moment, looking at the patient list posted on the wall, then spoke to Hugo in the same ordinary voice he might have used to ask for his coat. "Tomorrow night, the usual place. Tell him to come." Adeline hadn't intended to be there. She went to the restaurant in the North End the following evening only because Hugo came to collect her and said his employer wanted her to listen. When she asked what she was supposed to hear, he merely replied that since she had told them the story, she should hear the rest of it. She sat at a small table near the counter, concealed behind a pillar, and from there she could see everything. Silvio sat at the table at the far end of the room. Before him was a full plate of pasta, still steaming, and 2 glasses. The man who entered was around 40, wearing a leather jacket with his hair neatly combed back, and he had been smiling from the moment he stepped through the door. "You wanted to see me, boss? Sit down." The man sat. Silvio picked up the bottle of wine and slowly filled the man's glass, then set the bottle down without pouring any for himself. "Eat. I've already eaten. Eat." The man picked up his fork. The only sound in the dining room was the fork touching the porcelain plate. Silvio leaned back in his chair with both hands resting on the table and began speaking in the voice of someone telling an old story for amusement. "My mother worked in the fish processing plant by the docks. 14 hours a day, even in winter. Cold water, salt, knives. By the time I had grown this tall, her hands had split open everywhere, deep cracks that never healed. At night, she couldn't hold a spoon. I had to feed her." The man stopped chewing. "In all those years," Silvio said, She never once took a single penny from anyone that didn't belong to her. He leaned forward slightly. The shops out there belong to the children and grandchildren of people like her. The bakery on the corner belongs to the grandson of an old woman who has to choose every week between buying her medicine and paying for heat. You collected money from her twice in 1 month. Boss, I haven't finished. His voice didn't rise at all. That was what made the entire room turn cold. You didn't steal from me. I don't care about the money. You stole from the only thing that makes this neighborhood willing to let me exist. Do you understand? People tolerate me because they know there's only one price, and that price doesn't change. You just changed it. The man set down his fork. His face had turned deathly pale. I'll give it back. I'll repay twice the amount. Eat, Silvio said. Finish everything, because this is the last meal you'll eat in this city. No one stood up. No one touched anyone. The man remained there for a very long time, and at last, he rose, nodded once, and walked out the door. No one in the neighborhood ever saw him again. No one spoke of anything having happened to him because nothing had happened at all. He simply wasn't there anymore. After the door closed, Adeline stepped out from behind the pillar. She stood beside the table, looking at the untouched plate of pasta slowly growing cold. What are you? She asked. A protector or a monster? Silvio looked up at her. He didn't answer immediately. He picked up the glass of wine he had poured for the other man and moved it aside, beyond his own reach. I'm the monster guarding the door, he said. You tell me what the difference is. They walked back from the North End that night because Adeline said she wanted to walk, and Silvio didn't ask why. Hugo followed in the car at a distance far enough away that he couldn't hear anything. The road ran along the edge of the harbor, and the wind rising from the water was cold and carried the scent of salt. They walked a long way before either of them spoke. You told that story about your mother in there, she said. Was it true? Do you think I invented it to frighten someone? I don't know you well enough to think anything. Silvio stopped beside a low railing overlooking the water. He pointed toward a row of dark warehouses across the harbor, squat blocks of concrete, with nothing remarkable about them. The fish processing plant was there. It's abandoned now, he continued without looking at her. That winter, she coughed constantly. She had been coughing since before Christmas. She said it was the dust in the plant, that it happened every year. By the time she couldn't stand anymore, I ran to call a car. They took her to the hospital, and I sat in that corridor waiting. He paused. Then someone came out and asked for her paperwork, asked about insurance. I said I didn't know what insurance was. I said I would pay, that I had money saved, and they asked how much, so I told them the amount. He laughed softly, a laugh with nothing inside it. They looked at me the way adults look at a child who says he is going to become a pilot. Then they told me to take her home and bring her to another facility the next day, somewhere that would accept her. That place was some distance away by car. Were you able to take her there? There was no next day. The wind moved across the water, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded. They told me it was because she had arrived too late, and perhaps that was true. I don't know. I've never known whether anything would have been different if they had admitted her that night. That is what weighs on me most, not the fact that they sent us home. It's that I'll never know. Adeline looked down at the black water. What did you do after that? I grew up, he said, and I decided that no one in this neighborhood would ever be asked that question again. He raised a hand to his chest and touched a place beneath his collarbone through his shirt. I got this the night I took the neighborhood back. I was 19 then, and foolish enough to believe that being right was enough. He lowered his hand. It isn't enough, but there haven't been any drugs in this neighborhood since then, and no one has collected money twice in a single month. You can call that whatever you like. They continued walking. Adeline didn't speak again until they were near the turn leading toward her rented building, and when she did, her voice was much quieter. My mother died when I was little. I know. How much do you know? I know it was a car accident. On a rainy night. She nodded slowly. They found me a long time afterward. I can't remember anything about that period. I always thought I had forgotten because I was so young, but the doctor said that wasn't why. He said I had been unconscious almost the entire time, from beginning to end. She stopped, and she spoke her next words in a strange voice, almost gently. Later, I realized that might have been the only merciful thing about that night. Silvio said nothing. I remember only 2 things, she said. The sound of rain on the roof of the car, and my mother's hand. She held my hand, and she said something. What did she say? She told me not to tell father. She told me to wait until I was grown. Adeline shrugged in the way people did when they had shrugged over the same thing too many times throughout their lives. I kept thinking about it all those years. I asked my father about it only once, when I was still in school, and he said I had remembered it incorrectly. He said injured people often said senseless things. I believed him. She gave a faint laugh. I still think my mother wasn't fully conscious at the time. People in that condition might say anything. I've heard enough of them to know that. Silvio stood motionless beside her, staring straight ahead at the dark water. He didn't say a word, but the hand he had placed on the railing tightened until his knuckles turned white beneath the streetlight, and he kept it clenched that way until she turned away. Rosalind Pike came down to the church basement one Saturday afternoon, carrying 2 paper bags filled with gauze, medical tape, and several boxes of gloves that she claimed were nearing their expiration date and that the hospital intended to discard, something Adeline knew with certainty wasn't true. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around, taking in the makeshift examination table formed by pushing 2 school desks together, the student notebook containing the patients' names, and Emiliano sweeping the floor in the corner. "You've accomplished more than I expected," she said. "Father Emmett only lent me the space. Everyone has space. It's people who are rare." She set the 2 paper bags on the table, and just as Adeline bent down to pick them up, her pouch opened slightly, revealing an old photograph of her mother wearing the cream-colored pearl necklace. Rosalind froze. Adeline looked up and saw that all the color had changed in the woman's face. "Miss Pike? Are you all right?" Rosalind didn't answer. She stepped closer, then stopped and stared at the pearls resting against Adeline's collarbone in the way someone might stare at a face that had suddenly emerged from a crowd after many years. "Where did you get that?" "It belonged to my mother." "Your mother." She sank into the nearest chair and raised one hand to cover her mouth. Adeline had never seen this woman lose her composure. Not once in all the years she had worked under her. Not even on nights when the emergency room had been so crowded there was no room left to stand. "Miss Pike, you're frightening me." "Sit down," Rosalind said. "I have to tell you something. And I have to tell you now. Because I know that if I wait until tomorrow, I'll invent 100 reasons not to tell you." Adeline sat down. "Many years ago, when I was still working nights, there was a night when it rained terribly hard. A woman was brought in. She had been in a car accident on the road leading toward the outskirts of the city." Rosalind spoke slowly, one word at a time, like someone walking across ice. "She was conscious. Adeline. She was still conscious when she arrived." Adeline didn't move. "I was the nurse on duty. I cut away her clothing and removed her jewelry to give it to the records department. That was the required procedure. I took a pearl necklace from her neck." She looked up. I held it in my hand. I remember it because the pearls weren't white. They had faded to an old cream color, and I remember thinking that it was a family heirloom, not something bought in a store. Adeline's throat went dry. "What happened next?" Then she grabbed my wrist. She held it very tightly, more tightly than I thought someone in her condition could, and she said something to me. Rosalind drew a breath. She said, "Tell the girl to wait." The entire room fell silent. Even the sound of Emiliano's broom in the corner had stopped at some point. I asked her again. I asked which girl. "Ma'am, which girl?" She couldn't speak anymore. Rosalind raised a hand and rubbed her forehead. By morning, someone from the police had arrived. They took her belongings. They took the records. And by noon, the file for that case had been sealed. I was only the nurse working the night shift. When I asked questions, they told me to mind my own business. I didn't know her name. I never learned her name. She looked at Adeline. "I've thought about those words all these years. I've thought about them more often than I care to admit. I had one sentence and one necklace, and nothing that could lead me to any answers. I thought I would carry them to my grave." Adeline heard herself speak, but her voice sounded like it belonged to someone standing far away. "She was conscious. She was conscious. They told me my mother died at the scene." Rosalind said nothing. She merely looked at her, and that look had already answered the question. Adeline raised a hand and touched the necklace around her throat. The pearls faded to an old cream color that she had worn all those years, without knowing that another woman had once held them in her hands on a rainy night, in a corridor not far from where they now sat. "Tell the girl to wait," she repeated. "Do you understand what that means?" "No." Adeline stood, and she had to steady herself against the edge of the table. But that is the second time I've heard it. It took Hugo Mancuso nearly 3 weeks to trace the gun, and when he found it, he didn't call. He drove to the restaurant, waited until only the two of them remained in the room, then placed a file in front of Silvio and stepped back. "Read it, boss." Silvio read. He read slowly, turning each page, and his expression didn't change until he reached the final page, the one bearing the name of a small transportation company registered outside the city, a company with no vehicles, no warehouse, and no employees, only a single notation concerning the legal purchase of firearms to equip the security team for a forced clearance project many years earlier. Beneath that company, separated by 2 layers of paperwork, was the name of a corporation that everyone in the city knew. "Are you certain?" Silvio asked. "Certain." He closed the file. "Prepare the car, 2 o'clock in the morning." The house on Beacon Hill had an expensive alarm system, and 4 security guards working in shifts. Not one of them heard anything. When Gerald Thornquist awoke shortly after 2 o'clock and went downstairs because he saw light spilling through the gap beneath his study door, he pushed it open and found the desk lamp burning and a man sitting in his chair. A silver-haired man stood by the door with his arms folded and his hat in one hand. "Who are you?" "Sit down, Mr. Thornquist." "Security. They're drinking coffee outside," Silvio said. "They're paid by you. But they've been taking orders from me for a long time. That is something you should know. I'm not telling you to frighten you." Gerald sat in the chair opposite his own desk. Silvio placed 3 objects on the desktop, one at a time and without haste. The first was an X-ray image that, when held beneath the light, clearly revealed a small piece of metal lodged inside a man's abdominal cavity. The second was a stapled file, its first page bearing the name of a forensic laboratory, and its last bearing the name of a transportation company with no vehicles. "Read it. You don't need to read everything. You only need to read the last page." Gerald picked up the file. His hands didn't begin to tremble until he reached that page. "I didn't know about this," he said. "I truly didn't." "I know you didn't," Silvio said. "I've already checked. You didn't shoot me, and you didn't order anyone else to shoot me. You merely purchased guns for a group of men many years ago, and you never asked where those men went afterward, what they did, or whom they work for now." He leaned forward. "That is what I want you to understand. You don't have to pull the trigger to be guilty, Mr. Thornquist. You only have to pay for the weapon and look away." Then he placed the third object on the desk. It was an old photograph printed on paper that had yellowed at the corners. 2 women sat across from each other at a small table in a cafe, with a glass door behind them bearing words that appeared backward. One woman had brown hair and wore a coat, and she was writing something down. The other was older, dressed in a sweater, with both hands resting on the table. Gerald Thornquist looked at the photograph, and he could no longer speak. His face slowly turned white from his forehead to his chin, like water retreating from the shore. "You know who the woman on the left is," Silvio said, "and I know the woman on the right." He stood and fastened the button of his suit jacket. "I could erase you from this city in 2 days, Mr. Thornquist. You understand that perfectly well. Your corporation, your name, your position. 2 days. Then why don't you?" Silvio stood motionless beside the desk lamp for a moment. "Because your daughter stopped my bleeding with her wedding dress," he said. "She knelt beside the road for a man she had never met. And she didn't ask who I was. She didn't ask a single question." He took the hat Hugo held out to him. "If I touch you, I'll leave her with no one for the second time in her life. I won't do that to the person who saved me." He walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. "You had a wife who was brave enough to see a righteous cause through to the end. You have a daughter brave enough to kneel beside the road for a stranger. You're the richest man in this room, Mr. Thornquist, and you're the poorest man I've ever met." Adeline went to St. Bernadette Hospital that afternoon because old Amalia needed to have some tests done and couldn't read the appointment papers, and Adeline had promised to accompany her. She waited for the woman to finish on the 2nd floor, then walked toward the elevator to return to the lobby. The elevator doors were closing when a hand stopped them. Gerald Thornquist stepped inside. He saw her before the doors closed completely, and he had half a second to step back, to say he would take another elevator, to do anything at all. He didn't. He entered and stood in the opposite corner, separated from her by the exact width of the elevator car. The doors closed. The elevator descended a short distance, then came to an abrupt stop. The ceiling light flickered once, came back on, and the elevator didn't move again. An alarm sounded twice, then fell silent. On the electronic display, the number remained frozen somewhere between 2 floors. Adeline pressed the call button. A voice emerged from the small speaker, asking whether anyone was inside, then explaining that there was a problem in the machine room, that the maintenance team was working on it, and that they should please wait. She said thank you. Then she lowered her hand. The only sound left inside the elevator was the steady ventilation fan above their heads, the low hum no one would ordinarily notice, but which had now become the only other presence there. Gerald stared at the doors. Adeline stared at the doors. They hadn't spoken a single word to each other in months. He had had plenty of time to consider what he would say if he ever saw his daughter again. And he truly had thought about it many times. In the car, in his study, and during the nights when he passed the door of her room on the 2nd floor, without opening it, he had prepared several opening sentences in his mind. Now that he was standing there, not one of them was of any use. The ventilation fan continued to run. In the polished metal of the doors, she could see his faint reflection, distorted by the surface, and she watched him raise a hand to adjust his collar once, before lowering it again. He had grown older, she realized it, and she didn't want to. Time inside a broken elevator passed differently from time outside. Later, when someone asked, they both said it had lasted about 7 minutes. Neither of them knew for certain. Somewhere around the middle of that time, Gerald Thornquist cleared his throat. He didn't turn his head. He continued staring at the doors. "Are you cold?" Adeline didn't answer. She didn't turn toward him. She didn't nod, shake her head, or shrug. She stood motionless, staring at the doors as though no one had spoken at all. He didn't ask again. He didn't say anything else. There was a dry, mechanical sound somewhere above them. Then the elevator gave a slight jolt and began descending again. The electronic display changed to the next number. The bell rang. The doors opened. Adeline stepped outside. She didn't look back. She walked straight across the lobby, past the reception desk, and out through the glass doors, where old Amalia was waiting with her cloth bag in her hand. The woman asked whether everything was all right, and Adeline said, "Yes, everything is fine. Let's go." Inside the elevator, the doors remained open for a long time. No one stepped in. Gerald Thornquist remained exactly where he was in the farthest corner, his hands hanging at his sides. He looked out at the brightly illuminated lobby, at the place where someone had just passed. Then the doors slowly closed in front of him, and he remained inside, alone, as the elevator began to rise. Her nursing license had been suspended, which meant she was no longer permitted to enter the 4th floor as a nurse. But one morning, Consuelo Reyes went to the administrative office, waited until someone was available to see her, and signed a form listing Adeline Thornquist as an authorized family visitor. When they asked how the two of them were related, she thought for a moment, then said Adeline was family. On Thursday afternoon, Adeline returned to the 4th floor with a second box of colored pencils in her coat pocket. Toby was sitting propped against his pillows with his sketchbook open on his lap, and the moment he heard the door, he turned toward her. "Look at this." He turned the sketchbook around to face her before she even had time to sit down. On the page was a house with square windows and a slightly crooked chimney. 3 people stood beside one another in front of the door, and in the lower right corner, crouched on a step, was a cat with 3 smudged colors layered over one another, and only a short stump where its tail should have been. "I drew the cat." "Is that the same cat from before?" "Yes. I gave it a name." He pointed to the 3 people standing in front of the door. "This is you. This is Grandma. And this is the man in black whose shoulder the cat is always jumping onto." Adeline looked down at the drawing, and it took her a moment before she could answer. "Why did you draw him so tall?" "Because he really is tall." "When did you meet him?" "He came up here once. He only stood outside the door. He thought I was asleep." Toby picked up the gray pencil and added more shading to the wall of the house. "But I wasn't asleep." She sat in the plastic chair beside the bed and took a storybook from the drawer, the one with a boat pictured on the cover that they had begun reading the previous week. She continued from the marked place. She read slowly in a low voice, and every few pages, he interrupted with a question, asking why the captain had done something, what a certain word meant, or whether the bird in the picture was real. "Is this bird real?" "Yes. It lives over the ocean. It can fly very far." "How far?" "So far that it doesn't need to land for days at a time." "Then how does it sleep?" "It sleeps while it flies." He considered that for a moment, then nodded as though the answer was acceptable. They continued reading. On page 47, just as the boat entered a bank of fog, the boy stopped asking questions. Adeline finished the passage, then looked up. "Are you sleepy?" "Yes." He rested his head against the pillow and pulled the blanket up to his chin. "Please keep reading for me. I can still hear you." "Can you really?" "Yes. Just keep reading." She continued. On page 48, the boat emerged from the fog. On page 49, they saw land on the horizon. She read in exactly the same voice, neither faster nor slower, and she didn't look up. The nightlight spread a warm orange glow across the page. In the corridor, the sound of a cart passing by gradually faded into the distance. When she finished the chapter and finally lifted her eyes, the boy was asleep. He slept peacefully, one hand still resting on the cover of his sketchbook. She closed the storybook, placed it on the bedside cabinet, straightened his blanket, then turned off one of the lights. She stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving. The following morning, her telephone rang before dawn had fully broken. It was Consuelo. She wasn't crying. Her voice was so calm that it took Adeline several seconds to understand what she was saying. "He didn't wake up, miss." Adeline sat on the edge of her bed. Neither of them spoke for a very long time. Then Consuelo said only one more thing, so softly that it sounded as though she were speaking to herself. "He didn't have to wait for anyone. You were already there." She couldn't remember how she made her way home. She remembered standing at the streetcar stop for a very long time, allowing 2 streetcars to pass without boarding either one, and then finally walking. The distance was longer than she had expected, and she walked every step without feeling tired or cold, even though the wind from the harbor blew against her the entire way. When she reached her room, she closed the door and didn't turn on the light. She set down her bag, then sat on the floor with her back against the side of the bed, and her legs stretched out before her. She remained that way. Beyond the window, the lights along the docks continued to glow, casting trembling ribbons of gold across the water exactly as they did every other night. A ship's horn sounded somewhere far away. Someone downstairs closed a door. The heater inside the wall came on and fell silent, then came on again. She didn't cry. She only sat there. She thought about small and scattered things. She thought about the storybook still lying in the drawer, its final pages unread. She thought about how she had promised to bring a green pencil next time because the boy had said the old box had run out of green. She thought about how Consuelo would have to return her janitorial uniform because she had taken the night shift to remain close to her grandson. And now there was no longer any reason to work nights. The sky beyond the window changed from black to gray, then from gray to a pale, muted white. When daylight had fully arrived, Adeline stood. She opened the wardrobe. At the very back, behind several sets of work clothes, was a cloth bag she hadn't opened once since moving there. She took it out and pulled open the zipper. The dress was still inside, folded clumsily, with one side of its hem torn all the way to the knee, and the silk across the front stiffened into patches by stains that had dried long ago and turned brown. She sank onto the floor with the dress in her hands. Then she gathered it against her chest, held it tightly, and wept. She wept like someone who had never cried before, because she hadn't cried since she was a child. She hadn't cried in the grand hall. She hadn't cried at the foot of the stairs with the letter in her hand. She hadn't cried inside the broken elevator. Every one of those moments came at once, gathering into one, and there was nothing left inside her that could hold them back. She didn't hear the knock at the door. She didn't know the door had opened, nor did she know how much time had passed before she realized that someone was lowering himself onto the floor beside her. Silvio didn't say anything. He didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't tell her to stop crying, and didn't reach out to touch her shoulder. He merely sat beside her, resting his back against the same side of the bed, his hands on his knees, and remained there. Daylight gradually filled the room. Only when she had stopped, when her breathing had finally slowed, did he speak, and his voice was very soft as he looked straight ahead instead of at her. "When my mother died, I sat in that corridor until morning. No one came to collect me. People kept walking past, and no one asked what that little boy was doing there." He paused. "It was the same for you. That night on the road, it was a long time before anyone found you." He turned and looked at her for the first time. "We were 2 children no one came to collect, Miss Thornquist. The only difference is that we're grown now. It's our turn to go and collect someone else." That night, Hugo Mancuso searched everywhere for him and finally found him in the garage, sitting on the hood of the old car he had kept all those years and had never been willing to sell, his mother's car. The lights were off. For the first time in all the years Hugo had followed him, he saw Silvio cry. "I could buy this entire city, Hugo," he said, "but I couldn't buy that boy one more afternoon." The car stopped in front of St. Leo Church late one afternoon, and the woman who stepped out wore an expensive coat that didn't belong on this street at all. Priscilla Thornquist stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the basement door, before walking down the steps. She held an old tin box against her chest. Adeline was clearing the examination table when she looked up. The two sisters stared at each other across that damp room, and neither of them knew how to begin. "Please don't send me away yet," Priscilla said. "I have something. My mother divorced father. She moved out last month. I had to clear out that room." She placed the tin box on the examination table. This was at the bottom of the wardrobe, inside a shoebox, beneath 3 layers of towels. She opened the lid. Inside was an old portable cassette recorder, its plastic casing yellowed at the corners. "I listened to it 3 days ago." Priscilla's voice began to tremble. "I sat on the floor of that room all night. I was still sitting there when morning came." She pushed the recorder toward her sister. "I couldn't bring myself to listen to it a second time. You listen." Adeline looked at the recorder. She placed her hand on it, and her fingers were cold. Father Emmett had been stacking chairs at the far end of the room. He stopped, set down the chair in his hands, and walked outside, closing the door behind him. She pressed the button. There was a burst of static, followed by the sound of something brushing against the microphone, then the sound of breathing. Then a woman's voice began to speak. Adeline didn't recognize it. That was what hurt her first. Even before the words that followed, the realization that she hadn't recognized her own mother's voice, that it had been erased entirely from her memory during all those years, without her even knowing it. The voice stated which recording this was, gave the date, and said her name. Marguerite Thornquist. Then she began to read. She read like someone reading aloud to herself to make certain that everything held together. She spoke about a forced clearance project in the eastern part of the city, about land purchased through several layers of intermediary companies, and about families renting homes without long-term leases who therefore had nothing to hold on to when someone came knocking at their doors. She spoke about a security team that had been hired, armed, and paid to do things no one ever recorded on paper. Then she spoke about her source. She said the woman had agreed to speak after refusing 3 times, that she worked at the fish processing plant near the docks, that she had a son, and that she was afraid but had spoken anyway. She read the woman's name aloud. Inés Braganza. Adeline raised a hand to her mouth. The tape continued turning. Marguerite went on to describe the people who had been forced to leave, naming each family one by one, and among those names was one over which she paused longer than the others. A young mother with a small child who had been forced to move 3 times in a single year and who, after the final move, had no address left to record. Yolanda Reyes. Adeline sank into the nearest chair. Then the voice on the recorder changed. Marguerite spoke more slowly and said that she would deliver the file that night, that she had considered the decision for a very long time, and that there was something she needed to record in case she didn't have the chance to tell anyone. She said her husband knew. She said he had known from the beginning that he had begged her not to do it, and that when she picked up her car keys that night, he had stood in the doorway and watched her leave. And she said that when she reached the car, she heard him making a telephone call inside the house. She couldn't hear everything. She heard only one sentence. He called the corporation's chief legal counsel, a man she referred to by his surname, Ashgrove, and said only this to him: "Stop her." The tape continued for several more seconds, then ended. The static lingered. The recorder switched itself off. There wasn't a sound in the basement. Priscilla stood against the wall with both hands wrapped around her elbows. "He didn't say to kill her," she whispered. "I listened to that part again and again. He didn't say to kill her. He said to stop her," Adeline replied. Her voice no longer sounded like her own, and for all these years, he has told himself that all he said was to stop her. She looked down at the cassette recorder, resting on the examination table, between a box of gauze and the student notebook containing the patients' names. Here in this basement, in this very neighborhood, the mother of the man with amber eyes, the mother of the boy who had drawn the cat without a tail, and her own mother, 3 women, 1 crime, and the hand that had gripped hers on that rainy night hadn't been delirious. The hearing took place in a room on the 9th floor of an administrative building, a windowless room that smelled of old carpet. The board sat in a row behind a long table. Adeline sat alone in the chair positioned in the center of the room, wearing the only dark suit she still owned. Weston Ashgrove IV sat in the section reserved for the complainant, a file resting neatly on his lap. He didn't look at her even once. Later, when everything was over, and people asked why he had pursued a woman who had nothing left with such determination, he would say that he hadn't wanted to. The truth was that his father had read a small article in the local newspaper about a free clinic in a church basement on the eastern side of the city. He had investigated the address. He had compared it with the development project map. Then he had summoned his son to his study, pointed to that location on the map, and said that a nurse trusted by the entire neighborhood was no longer merely a woman. She was a legal obstacle, and obstacles had to be removed before they had time to take root. Weston hadn't argued. He never argued. The chairman read the accusation aloud, and Weston presented his case. He presented it very well. He spoke about the strict nature of medical regulations, about the community's trust in the medical profession, and about how forgiving one exception would open the door to 10 more. He didn't say a single malicious word. That was precisely what made it worse. When he sat down, the chairman asked whether Adeline had anything further to present, and just as she opened her mouth, the door at the back of the room opened. Silvio Braganza walked in. A faint sound passed through the room, the sound of everyone sitting straighter at once. One board member at the end of the table removed his glasses, then put them on again. The clerk stopped typing. Silvio didn't look at any of them. He walked directly to the front and placed an envelope and a stack of notarized papers on the table. "With your permission, I would like to submit 2 items," he said. "The first is the recording from my vehicle's dashboard camera, with its original timestamp intact. The second is my sworn statement, given before a notary public, describing what this woman did for me beside Interstate 93. The chairman asked how he was connected to the respondent. "I'm nothing to her," Silvio said. "I'm the man who wouldn't be sitting here if she had continued driving that day like everyone else." Then he stepped back and took a seat in the last row, saying nothing else for the remainder of the hearing. The door opened a second time. Father Emmett Sarsfield entered with one hand resting on his cane, and behind him came the people of Eastie. They entered one at a time in silence, and lined the walls because there weren't enough chairs. Some still wore their safety gear after finishing work. One woman carried a small child in her arms. Emiliano, 16 years old, stood at the end of the line with both hands in his pockets. Each person held a handwritten page. "We don't know how the procedure works," Father Emmett said, "so we simply wrote everything down. Those who couldn't write asked someone else to do it for them." The pages were passed to the board's table in a thick stack. The chairman read the first few, then removed his glasses. Old Amalia came forward when her name was called. She stood there, small and fragile in her best sweater, and spoke in the halting English she had always felt uncomfortable using in front of strangers. "I am sick. I didn't collect my medicine because of the heating bill." She paused, searching for the words. "She tested me. Every week she tested me. She made me come back." She looked toward the board. "She never asked if I had money. Not one time. Do you understand? Not one time." Then Rosalind Pike stood, walked to the table, and placed a thick file upon it. "This is Miss Thornquist's complete employment record from the emergency department at St. Bernadette Hospital," she said. "Please count the complaints in that file for me. I'll wait." No one spoke. "There aren't any," she said. "Not one in all those years." I placed the letters of gratitude in a separate section at the end, because including them with everything else made the file too thick. The board deliberated for more than an hour. When its members returned, the chairman read the decision in an even voice, stating that after considering the circumstances, the fact that the medication had been replaced in full, the complete record, and all testimony presented, the board dismissed the accusation and reinstated her nursing license, effective immediately. Then he paused and added a sentence that wasn't in the written decision. "Miss Thornquist, on behalf of the board, I apologize." The meeting took place in the back room of the restaurant in the North End, with 7 men seated around the long table. Silvio spoke for no more than 10 minutes. He said that all operations at the port would be transferred to clean, legitimate records, that the books would be opened, that the monthly collections in the Eastern District would end entirely, rather than merely be reduced, and that the process would take many years and make all of them poorer for a very long time. Then he sat down. The man who objected was Corbin Vasari, the head of the Southern Branch, a man at around 50 whose voice was louder than necessary. He spoke at length about 3 generations spent building what they had, about how no one had the right to tear down something he hadn't built himself, then concluded with a sentence containing a particular word for Adeline. No one in the room moved. Silvio didn't stand. He didn't strike the table. He merely looked up and asked in an ordinary voice, "What did you just call her?" Corbin Vasari opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He didn't repeat the word. The meeting ended in silence, and 3 nights later, the basement of St. Leo Church caught fire. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Adeline was inside with 2 patients, a man who worked the afternoon shift at a warehouse and had a deep cut on his forearm, and old Amalia, who had arrived late because she walked slowly. The first explosion came from the stairs near the cleaning supplies. The electricity went out. The smoke descended quickly, faster than she had imagined anything could move, and in the darkness, the only staircase was no longer a way out. Adeline pulled both patients into the farthest corner, where a small window near the ceiling opened onto the back courtyard, and she smashed it with a metal chair. She pushed the old woman through first. The man followed her. By the time Adeline's turn came, the smoke was so thick that she could no longer find the edge of the window. She heard someone calling her name from very far away. Then a hand seized her by the collar. Silvio pulled her out through the burning staircase, walking ahead of her and using his back and shoulders to shield the narrowest passage so she could squeeze through. When they reached the courtyard, they both collapsed onto the concrete. Hugo extinguished the flames on Silvio's shirt with his own coat. Silvio's left shoulder was burned in the exact place where an old scar ran down from his collarbone, a scar he had carried home from another night, many years earlier. The ambulance arrived, then the fire engines, and the entire neighborhood poured into the street. While they waited to move Silvio into the ambulance, Hugo stood watching the flames lick through the basement window frame and spoke without looking at anyone. "He didn't burn this basement." He turned toward Adeline. "He burned the thing that made my boss become a different man." Inside the ambulance, the paramedic made room for her after she said she was a nurse and showed the license that had just been reinstated. She cut away Silvio's shirt, cleaned the burn, and covered it with moist gauze, but her hands were trembling. She had done this thousands of times in her life, and her hands had never trembled before. She had to stop for a moment, draw a breath, then continue. Silvio lay staring at the ceiling of the ambulance. "Leave it for them to handle. Lie still. Your hands are shaking. Please lie still for a moment." He truly did remain quiet for a while. Then he spoke. "I've accomplished many things in my life. Every one of them required someone to be afraid of me before it could be done." He turned his head and looked at her. "Pulling someone out of a burning place is the only thing I've ever done without having to be the monster. Let me do that one thing well." 4 days later, before he had even been discharged from the hospital, Silvio ordered Hugo to bring him every file, including the one about the gun, everything else Hugo had uncovered about the night of the fire, and all the other evidence Silvio had kept for years without ever using. He called a telephone number, and the man who came to see him that afternoon wore a gray suit and presented a badge bearing 3 letters. Hugo waited until the man had left before speaking. "You know, doing that breaks the code of silence." "I know. That code has kept us alive all these years." Silvio sat propped against his pillows with his shoulder completely bandaged, looking through the window toward the harbor. "That code exists only as long as people remain afraid, Hugo," he said, "and I'm not afraid anymore." The case from that rainy night was reopened in the fall, and news of it appeared in the newspapers before anyone had time to prepare. The report said that an old traffic accident was being reconsidered as a criminal matter. They said there was new evidence, and they named a veteran attorney, the father of a sitting senator, as the subject of the investigation. After the 3rd article, the telephone at the Ash Grove residence stopped ringing because the people who had once called no longer did. Weston came to see her one afternoon in October. By then, the clinic had been temporarily rebuilt, no longer in the basement but in the storage building behind the church, where Emiliano and several of his friends had spent 3 weekend days whitewashing the walls. Adeline was updating the records when she saw his shadow in the doorway. He had grown thinner. His suit was the same kind he had always worn, but it hung loosely across his shoulders. "I'm not coming inside," he said. "I'll stay here." She put down her pen. "What do you need?" "I didn't come to ask for anything." He looked around the storage room, at the plastic chairs and the student notebook on the table. I only want to tell you one thing, and then I'll leave. She waited. I never hated you, he said. I know saying that now sounds very convenient for me, but it's the truth. There wasn't a single day when I hated you. He paused, searching for the right words, and it was the first time in all those years that she had ever seen him struggle to find them. I was simply a coward. My father told me to do something, and I did it. He pointed to a place on a map and told me to clear it away, so I did. I didn't ask a single question. He laughed, but the smile that accompanied it was twisted. I've never questioned him once in my entire life. What do you want me to say, Weston? I don't want you to say anything. He looked down. I've only just understood something, and I thought you should hear it from me. People who hate at least have a reason. Cowards don't have reasons. They only have choices, and every time, they choose the easier one. He looked up. I think cowardice is worse than hatred, Adeline, because a coward always has another road available. She remained silent for a long time. Then she stood and walked around the table, but stopped several steps away from him. I've already forgiven you, she said. His eyes brightened, and she saw it. So she continued before that hope could travel any further. I forgave you because I don't want to carry you inside me for the rest of my life. That forgiveness is for me, not for you. She looked directly into his eyes. But forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door again. That door is closed, Weston. It closed the day you made that telephone call in the study of my house. He nodded slowly. He didn't plead. It was the kindest thing he did in this entire story. He merely thanked her, then turned away, and Adeline heard his car start outside in the courtyard. The new clinic opened on a Saturday morning in early November. It wasn't large. It had 2 examination rooms, 1 waiting room, and a small kitchen where tea could be made for those who arrived early. People from the neighborhood came before the doors opened and formed a line stretching all the way to the sidewalk, because Father Emmett had announced that anyone who wanted their blood pressure checked could have it done free that day, and the people in this neighborhood never missed anything free. Adeline stood at the reception desk. She saw him while the line was still long. Gerald Thornquist stood somewhere in the middle, wearing a coat that wasn't his most expensive, with no one accompanying him, no car waiting outside, and no attorney. He stood behind a woman holding a child and in front of a man wearing safety gear. The line moved forward a little at a time, and he moved with it. He stood there for nearly an hour. When his turn came, he stepped forward and placed a small box on the counter. He opened the lid. Inside was the pearl necklace. Its pearls faded to an old cream color. I came to return this to you, he said. It was never mine. He paused, then continued in a very calm voice, the voice of a man who had practiced this sentence many times in his car. Thank you for accepting it, Miss Thornquist. Adeline looked at him. She allowed the silence to stretch so long that the person behind him began staring down at his own feet. Thank you, Mr. Thornquist. Something in his face collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. It was only something around his eyes and mouth, something he had fought to hold in place throughout the hour he had spent waiting in line, and now he could no longer hold it. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach across the counter. He merely stood there with his hand still resting on the box. I protected a name, he said. I spent my entire life protecting it, and I lost the only person who ever carried that name with honor. Then he withdrew his hand, nodded once to the person behind him, and walked toward the door. The following morning, without anyone telling him to go or taking him there, Gerald Thornquist drove himself to the federal office downtown, waited among the chairs in the lobby until someone came to speak with him, and said that he had a statement to give concerning a rainy night many years earlier. Adeline kept the necklace. She placed it in the drawer of her desk, and she didn't wear it. He took her to the harbor late one autumn afternoon, when the wind coming off the water had grown cold enough to make people pull their collars higher. They stood before the row of squat warehouses he had pointed out to her the last time, where the fish processing plant had once stood, its doors now rusted and grass growing through cracks in the concrete. My mother stood here, he said, right here, every day. He reached into his coat pocket, took out a small object, and held it in his palm. I can't promise you a clean life. The name I carry will follow me for many more years, and it'll follow you too. Some doors will close to you because of me. I know that, and I won't pretend otherwise. He opened his hand. All I can promise you is an honest life. Adeline looked down. It wasn't a diamond ring. It was the silver ring engraved with an anchor that he had always worn on his right hand, resized to fit her finger, its engraving worn smooth by all those years. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. "I was injured on that rainy night. The doctor said it would be nearly impossible for me to have children." She spoke in an even voice, the voice of someone who had rehearsed the words many times in her mind but had never spoken them aloud to anyone. "I kept that secret all these years. Weston knew. He knew before he proposed to me, and later I realized that was precisely why they chose me. A wife like that was convenient for their other calculations." Silvio said nothing for a while. Then he took her hand and placed the ring in her palm instead of sliding it onto her finger. "I'm not asking you for a child," he said. "I'm asking you for a life. Keep this. Wear it when you're ready." She put it on that same afternoon. When the case from that rainy night was finally brought into the light, it encountered something no one wanted to hear. The statute of limitations for the charge that could have been brought against Gerald Thornquist had expired long ago. His testimony didn't send him to prison for even a single day, but it did bring Weston's father before a court, and it forced the corporation's board of directors to hold an emergency meeting during the night and vote to remove Gerald from his position. Within a year, he lost his seat, lost his name from the top of the building, and lost the Beacon Hill house when he was forced to sell it to pay the legal fees from the civil lawsuits that followed. He didn't lose his freedom. He merely lost everything he had sacrificed his daughter to preserve, and he lived for many more years so that he could understand that clearly every morning when he awoke. Rosalind Pike passed away in her sleep one spring night, at an age she had always said was far too young for retirement. Adeline had visited her the previous afternoon. The two women sat drinking tea and talking about everything imaginable, and before Adeline left, Rosalind took her hand. "Listen to me," she said. "People like to measure a city by the buildings it can construct. They're completely wrong. If you want to understand a society, look at how it treats the person lying beside the road. That is the only place you need to look." The clinic was named Tobias Reyes. The sign above the door was painted to match the drawing in the boy's sketchbook. A house with a slightly crooked chimney, a calico cat sitting on the steps with a short stump of a tail, and 3 people standing before the door. Consuelo Reyes resigned from the hospital's night shift and became the clinic's receptionist, and she remembered the name of every person who walked through the door, without missing a single one. Priscilla coordinated the volunteers on weekends, and she continued doing so for many years without mentioning her surname even once. Gerald Thornquist came to sweep the courtyard every Saturday morning. He arrived early, finished sweeping, and left without speaking to anyone. When a local newspaper wanted to photograph him, he shook his head and departed through the back door. He continued through the entire winter, through the entire spring, and through many more months without anyone telling him he had to. Then, one Saturday morning, Adeline walked into the courtyard, stood for a moment watching him sweep, and stepped toward him. "Dad." The wedding took place at St. Leo Church the following summer. The people from the eastern neighborhood filled the front rows, while those in expensive suits happily sat in the back. Outside in the courtyard, the Countess leaped onto the banquet table, stole a piece of fish, then raced around the yard with all the children chasing behind her, their laughter carrying all the way to the church steps. Later, whenever anyone asked why she had stopped the car that afternoon, Adeline always gave the same answer. She said that her mother had once stopped for a stranger too, and no one had stopped for her mother. This story leaves us with something very simple, yet perhaps the most difficult thing in the world to do. True kindness never asks first who the other person is, whether they're rich or poor, or whether they deserve to be helped. It asks only one question, whether that person is in need. A person's honor doesn't lie in the name they carry. It lies in whether they have the courage to stop when the entire world is sounding its horn and driving past. And there are gifts that money can't buy, such as one peaceful afternoon, or someone willing to sit beside us when we have nothing left to say. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that together we can listen to more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And if you had been there, would you have stopped beside the road that day? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.